Hello everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I am your resident fantasy therapist and welcome to my channel. Those of you who are returning, welcome back. Those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. As I said, my name is Kat Bowser. I am a licensed therapist, but I am also an author working on my first novel. So on my channel, I like to dig into what I consider to be the heart of writing, which is the characters. And the heart of the characters is in their psychology. So you will find all types of writing tips, writing discussion videos on my channel, all dealing with the psychology behind what makes these characters great, what makes these stories great. So this video is actually a request from one of my viewers, and I'm so sorry if I say your name wrong. Del Cecil Runo. Again, I'm horrible with pronunciation. But I have linked her in the description below. She is an absolute wonderful person to chat with. She has some great ideas, so please check her channel out. Anywho, she suggested the topic for today's video, which I am including in my Trope Diagnosis series, and that is, how does power corrupt? I think one of the best ways to approach this is to just take it literally one step at a time. So I thought we would start with what I consider the protective factors. So these are the traits that can help prevent power from being a corruptive force. First and foremost, moral identity. Now, moral identity is essentially how important is being a moral person to someone's sense of identity. And morality, as I've mentioned before, is very varied. It kind of depends on your culture, your society. But as a general rule, some of the factors that we consider to be almost universal is honesty, being compassionate, being kind, things like that. So if someone has a very strong or high sense of moral identity, in other words, being very moral is very important to who they are, that is a protective factor against corruption. Another protective factor, coming from a humble beginning can usually help you out. This one is up for debate because there have been numerous examples of people that come from humble backgrounds and they still end up being corrupted. But it has been identified as a factor that can give you a little bit of protection. So I'll include it in here. Next things to take into account. When we have someone who comes into power, we essentially have two separate goals. We have what we call societal goals, which is the goals that are best for people, and then we have personal goals, so goals that benefit themselves and or their family. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. You can do societal goals and also have those benefit your family, benefit your status. And that's usually when they work the best, honestly, because then the leader is not just worrying about the people that he or she is supposed to mind, but also about their own family and their own success. But then you have a little problem that sneaks in when you have societal goals that conflict with personal goals. And that is when the next part of the equation kind of comes into effect. There is usually a sense of division between the leader and or his family and the rest of the people. So it becomes kind of what we call an us versus them mentality. And whenever you have that kind of division, you introduce a lot of possibilities for both conflict and competition. So it's not a cohesive team effort, even though that may be what it started out as. It now becomes, okay, you have the leader here, and then you have the rest of the people over here. And the leader is often regarded as separate from the rest of the people. I'm going to reference two experiments here, actually, and they were both done. One was done in the 40s, the late 40s, and one was done in, I believe, the 60s. The first you probably heard of is called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And basically, what this was is a series of college students were selected. I believe it was a total of, I think it was 21 total when everything was said and done. And they were selected because of their scores on psychological tests and their grades, among other factors. But basically, they were selected because they were even kill, middle of the road, didn't have any psychological problems, none of that. And they were put in a situation where a mock prison was set up in the basement of a college, and each of these participants were randomly assigned either to be a prison guard or to be a prisoner. And this experiment was initially started because the experimenters wanted to look into what was causing all these harsh treatment that they had been seen reported in jails, and they wanted to see if it was due to innate personality factors or if it was due to the environment itself. So, enter this experiment. And almost, I'm gonna say almost immediately, the people who were in positions of power, as in the ones assigned to be a prison guard, were very quick to utilize that power. They became verbally abusive towards the prisoners. They became physically abusive over a course of several days, including taking away the prisoners' beds, removing those privileges from them, and overall just being very caustic and demeaning. And it actually got to the point where it was becoming so dangerous that they actually ended the experiment. I believe it only lasted about 6 days, and it was supposed to go for 2 weeks. And that is one example of taking people who honestly are pretty run-of-the-mill people and putting them in a situation where they have absolute power, and see what happens. The other experiment is called the Robbers Cave experiment, and it was done with a group of boys. I believe they were around middle school aged, and they were essentially split into 2 groups at a Boy Scout camp, and each group was originally unaware of the other's existence, and they were basically engaged in a bunch of team building exercises to make them think cohesively as a group and to work together. Then they introduced the second part of the phase, which was where they were introduced to each other, and they introduced competitiveness. So now the 2 groups were working against each other. And what ended up happening is the competitiveness grew to such an extent that they were getting violent with each other. And these were boys that had never met before, had no pre-existing grudge against each other, but they began to ransack one another's property, steal private property, break personal belongings. There was an instance where one ate all the other's food, things like that. And so that was another instance of competitiveness and power kind of coming into play. So the reason I bring these 2 experiments up is because I think that there is a common factor in both of them that contributes to the power corrupts kind of ideal. And that is the dehumanization of the other group. In the Stanford Prison experiment, all the prisoners were not allowed to use their names or have personal affix. They were simply known by their number. Within the Robbers Cave experiment, the other group they were assigned a group name, but there was no individuality included within the groups for each other. So one group had strong individuality within their group, but outside of their group, not so much. And that seems to be what really happens when power starts to corrupt, is there is a widening division between the people that have power and the people that don't. Most of the time, this is usually related to wealth. So usually people in charge typically have more money. Um, you can actually see this really well if you look at the French Revolution. There became a much wider berth between the rich aristocrats and the poor common people. So, what does this mean when it comes to aspects of power being a corrupting factor? This is where people are kind of divided. There is this belief that power does corrupt, but there is also this belief that power doesn't necessarily corrupt, but rather exposes traits that were already there. And there might be some truths to that because usually people who are elected into power, they usually share very common traits. They're usually very good speakers. Most of the time they've been involved in politics for a while. They've been involved in leadership positions. So they've had positions of power before, but probably not to the extent that they get it once they're elected or once they take power. So for myself, I think what is most interesting about this is, like I said, the division between the people in power and the people without power. But it's also interesting from a historical perspective because we see this over and over and over and over again throughout history. And one of the things that we notice is that people who come into power, they very rarely become corrupt overnight. There's usually a process where you kind of see them gradually either take more and more power or they stop giving or being respectful of the lower class like they have been. So one thing that I think is important is there is something that we call, in psychology, we call it thought distortions. And what this is, it is a defense mechanism, and everybody has them, where when something goes wrong or something goes awry, your brain tries to rationalize it. And one of the things that happens a lot, especially with people that happen to have low self-esteem, is what we call discounting the positive, which is where when something good has happened, your brain finds a reason why it doesn't count. And I bring this up because people in power generally have something the opposite happen. When something negative goes wrong, their brain finds a way to rationalize it, to kind of call to attention, well, this wasn't because of me, or this doesn't apply to me because of XYZ. And this usually starts pretty small, like maybe with a riot that broke out or something that isn't exactly what we would call on a global scale, but it still happens and it still causes conflict. And a lot of the time, honestly, societies kind of contribute to this because sometimes leaders are placed almost on a pedestal in a way. For myself, I'm from the United States, and there was, for quite a bit of history, this idea that the president could be above the law because he was the president. There wasn't a lot of logic behind that, but it was a societal idea. And I think that same kind of thing applies when we're talking about power corrupting someone. So I know I've kind of jabbered here and there and all over the place with this topic, but basically what it boils down to is someone that has a low moral identity, someone who may be moral for the most part, but it's not what they consider high on their list of values. Someone who has come from a position of power, or at least not a position of humility, so to speak, not from a position where they've had to be a victim. Having a separation of some sort between the leader and the rest of the country, rest of the group, whatever it is that's going on. Having societal feedback for that separation, whether it be, skin color, culture, class, whatever. Something in society backs up this idea. Dehumanization between the groups. So something that allows the leader or the people in charge to look at people outside their group as they're different from us. They're not the same, whatever that might be. We saw that in history gradually with the Jewish population in Germany under Hitler, with the taking away of their shops, the wearing of the yellow stars, and eventually the movement into the ghettos and the extermination camps and so on and so forth. And like I said, that was not an overnight thing. It took place over time. So any kind of separation and dehumanization of the other group is going to lead to a corruption of power. And I think that is the basis of it. Like I said, this is a very, very complex topic, but I do love talking about it because it's very interesting. There are definitely mental traits that contribute to it. Someone that has a high sense of self is going to have that natural division between themselves and other people. Someone who is manipulative because they've learned how to be through family or friends or however they grew up, they've learned that in order to survive and do well, you have to put your personal goals first instead of societal goals. That contributes to it. So there's a lot of different factors that factor into it, but I think overall, if you kind of take all of these into account, you can really write a convincing either a villain or what I like to see as a hero that slowly falls. Because if you think about most heroes, especially in classic hero stories, they have a lot of traits that kind of lead them to be corrupted by power. A lot of times I think what we see now is people who become almost delusional in that they say that they are protecting the people, they're extending their control over the people to protect them, and in the process they've essentially become what they set out to defeat. And I think that is very fascinating, and that is also essentially a thought distortion taken to the extreme. So I guess to wrap it up is take into account their upbringing, take into account their personality traits, and then most importantly, take into account what is the division between them and the rest of the people. Because if there's a division there, having power is just going to make it grow and grow and grow. So that is my digging into what makes power corrupt. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, I know I've kind of jumped around a lot on this topic because there really is a lot to talk about. And again, I only really scratched the surface of it, but I still hope you guys found it interesting. If you enjoy this content, please leave me a comment or follow me on social media. Let me know. If you're so inclined, feel free to subscribe. I put up new videos on Thursdays and Sundays. And until next time, I hope you guys have a good one.